Alright, so we're back, and in this video we're going to build our first alpha-based sprite. The sprites we've built so far didn't use their alpha channel at all, which was cool, but not exactly super helpful. I also want to point something out real quick. We didn't actually use this in the last video, but our prototype sprites, because in that material we tied in vertex color, we can change their color. So if we want the floor to have a certain color, like red, all we have to do is choose that prototyping sprite and then go over to sprite color, and we can just set that to any color we like, which can be really useful if you're just trying to get a feel for certain areas, particularly when prototyping. Now I'm going to set that back over to, well, something not quite so garish anyway. I'm fine with it having a little bit of color. That's fine. So let's create our very first sprite with an alpha channel. Now this is taken right from the template, but we're going to create this sprite from scratch. So here inside my sprites folder, let's right click and we'll go to miscellaneous and you'll see sprite. So we'll make that and we will call this, well, what should we call this? We should call it something like ledge, because that's what it's going to be for, or platform. Platform makes a lot more sense. Let's call it that. So this will be our platform sprite, and currently it has nothing in it. So we'll double click it to open it up, and we need to give this a source texture. Now it comes in with a default material, which is the unlit sprite material. That's perfect. We're going to leave that just like it is. For the source texture, right now if we click, we've got a lot of different textures to sort through, but very near the top you'll see 2D background block atlas, which is the texture that we imported early. So let's go ahead and click that. Now, it's going to be a little tricky to see what we're looking at. I have to zoom out quite a bit here. Now, this is what we want, this area up here in the upper left. But to show you kind of what we're really seeing here, first, let's take a look at the texture itself. So I'm going to browse to that in the content browser, and then we'll double click it here in the content browser. And what I want to show you is that we can visualize the alpha channel real quick. So let's turn off all of our color channels and just take a look at alpha, and you can see the alpha for that little platform right up there in the corner, which is perfect. So we don't really need that anymore. Let's go ahead and close that, come back to here, and we can talk a little bit more about the sprite editor window. Primarily, it's really some of the more important things that you need to be aware of. So we have source UV and source dimension. We're going to be editing that manually, so we don't really need to worry about these numbers. We have source texture, which is fairly self-explanatory. The default material, so how we want to work with that texture, also very important. Sockets are a way that we can attach other objects to points on this. We're not going to be doing anything with that in this video, but pretty easy to play with if you'd like to explore that on your own. We have pixels per unit. This is a way to kind of get you back to having a 256 style or a power of 2 grid, because when you bring in textures into the Unreal Engine, if they're not powers of 2, then they're not going to have bitmaps, and generally that's a bad thing. So most of your textures are going to come in, actually all of them should come in at powers of 2, but we have a decimal grid. So by setting your pixels per unit to something like 2.56, which is kind of like a 100th of a power of 2 value, then you are in essence converting this back over to a grid that should snap to pixels. Now we have pivot mode for the sprite. This is where the pivot for each sprite is going to be placed, both horizontally and vertically. So if you click on this, you see it drops down. You could do like bottom center, which is pretty common for things like characters. In the case of something like this, which will just be a static object, it's not really super important. So we're going to leave this at center center. We're not going to worry about an alternate material. Now, this does expand, and there are a few other things in here that we're not going to really be exploring at the moment, but just so you know, there's some extra properties down there. We have the rendering section, so we can control the render geometry. I'll be showing that separately in just a moment, and then we can control the collision as well, which, again, I'll address a little bit later on. Now, I really want to mention the modes up here at the very top. We have View, Edit Source Region, Edit Collision, and Edit Render Geometry. View shows you what your sprite currently looks like. Edit Source Region tells you what percentage or what part of that sprite sheet texture you're actually sampling. And right now we're sampling the whole thing, which is not going to be super useful for us. So let's fix that first before we go on to the next mode. Now the way I'm going to do that is if we take a look up here in the left corner, we're actually sampling this edge of our little platform rather well, but we need to fix kind of grabbing this end of it in the bottom. So I'm going to click on the lower right-hand corner of the sample region, and we'll simply move that. So I'll snap that right up against the bottom of the platform. And then we'll slide over and snap like so. Now, if you're having a difficult time snapping right into position, just change your snap value. We'll pull that down to a single pixel for just a moment and carefully pop that right into place. So that looks pretty good for our sample region. So now if we jump back to view, now you can see we only see this part of the sprite because now that is all we're sampling in our source region. So now we can go to Edit Collision. Now, Edit Collision is a way for us to control how our character is going to interact with, physically bump into this sprite, and as well as other objects as well. Really, anything that needs to collide with it will hit this shape. There's a lot of different ways to adjust this, but let's take a look at some of the automated methods first. We have Collision Geometry Type as a property here under Collision. Currently that's set to Tight Bounding Box. That's using the alpha channel to snap a box tightly around the region. We can use Source Bounding Box, which in our case is going to be really, really close because we manually drag that to a really tight area. We can also do Shrink Wrapped. And you can see that is going to take the alpha channel and cut around it. And we can do Fully Custom, which allows us to make our own changes, which I'll show you how to do that here in just a minute. Now, Diced is a way that you can split up your collision geometry into a whole bunch of separate pieces that are kind of combined together, which we're not going to really need to explore for this shape. For now, let's set this back to Tight Bounding Box, because while Shrink Wrap is really cool, it's also really complex, and the only problem I have with that is it looks like it might be pretty simple for us to snag our character on one of these lips at the upper area. So let's not do that. Let's instead start with Tight Bounding Box, and then we're going to edit this. So I'm going to click on the right-hand side and press the Insert key to add a vertex. I don't know how often you actually look around a screen when you're using a tool. I know I'm terrible about this, but it actually tells you this in the upper left-hand corner to press Insert and add a vertex, and then you can click on a vertex and hit Delete to remove it. So just to point this out, I'd been using the tool for quite a while before I even noticed that was up there. So I'm going to add a point to the left side and to the right side, and we will slide those up so they go kind of right on the underside of that lip. Like so. Now, let's go ahead and do that one more time. I'll select this edge and press Insert, and I'll select the far edge and press Insert again. And I'm actually going to increase my snaps. Let's go to 10 on snaps, and I'm going to pull this in so it pops right up against the side of the platform, and this one in as well. And then we will grab these corners and just pull them in. Now, I'd like to get that a little bit closer, so let's try snapping down to 5. That looks pretty good. This does not need to be super precise. But by having kind of a more beveled area, there's a lot less there for somebody to potentially get snagged on. Now, I'm liking that. I think that works well for collision. So that allows me to jump over to the next tab, which is Edit Render Geometry. Now, this is useful if you have a sprite sheet that is really densely packed and you could be sampling some other asset here inside our image. So, for example, if we were to take a look at our source region, if you can imagine somebody having put like a smiley face or something right here in the corner, and here inside our view, we'd be able to see the edge of that smiley face. It would be showing through because of the area of our source region. We can fix that with render geometry. So if we had to chop that out for some reason, we could simply grab this edge, and just like with collision geometry, we could insert and add another vertex, maybe pull it down to about here, and then just slide this vertex over, and that would in turn kind of chop out that smiley, so that wouldn't actually render anymore. Now, we're not going to leave it that way. I just wanted to point out that that's what this is used for. It's just a way to kind of customize your sample area even further. We'll leave that at Tight Bounding Box, just like it was. So with that, we can go ahead and hit Save. We are done with this sprite. Let's close out the sprite editor, and we could drag one of these into our world. So here's our platform. Let's just bring it in, and you see it's got a pretty nice size to it. And there's a little bit of ghosting there at the edge. It looks like we're sampling just a little bit of that outer edge. And you can see like like 1 pixel of alpha is coming in. And I'm worried that that would be visible during gameplay. There's a pretty good chance that it wouldn't be, but if it ever flickered in, that could be really problematic. Now, it's one of those things where you kind of have to gauge the value at this point. So here's the size of our character. So if we were viewing from something like here, we would probably never see that. But as a way just to kind of cover all of our bases, let's edit the render geometry to solve this. Now we could just shrink wrap it, but I don't want to do that because that makes for really complex geometry. So let's just add a vertex here and a vertex here, just like we did with collision, and we'll slide that up and get that right underneath that little lip there at the very top. Let's go ahead and add another point on either side. And just as before, we'll just pop that in. And I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap there. I don't want to completely overlap like I did with collision geometry. So we're just kind of chopping out those descending lines on either side. As a matter of fact, let's see. And no, that's good. That's still outside the pixel range. I'm okay with that. And we'll just carefully pop this in just a little bit, and that should chop that out. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and save. We can close, and now if we zoom in, you see those little lines on the side are snipped away. So that solves that problem. Okay, so now we've added a platform, which is pretty cool. There's a couple other things we can do. Now, because we're using that default material, note that we can take the sprite color and we can change it, and thereby change the color of these platforms. So we've still got a little bit of flexibility there. If you, again, I can just point this back out if you're curious as to how that works. It is because the master material is multiplying in vertex color. And vertex color, in the case of a sprite, is driven by sprite color. So we can go ahead and close these back out. Now, the only other thing I wanted to do, and this is really just for fun, is show you that we can simulate physics with a sprite using that collision that we set up earlier. So let's go ahead and rotate this to something kind of interesting. And then here inside the settings for the sprite, we'll just say simulate physics, and let's click on the simulate button. And you see how it tumbles and falls away? Well, that's kind of a problem, and it's actually a problem on two fronts. One, we drag this into the map, and remember, its y coordinate is important. Currently, it's set to -190 because it dropped to the background. So let's set that to 0, and if we simulate again, it falls, and then it gets really wonky wobbly, and that also looks bad. That's because it's simulating in all three axes. To show this off, let's go ahead and jump over to a perspective view. And you can see that our level is really kind of taking place in a pseudo 3D world here. Let's go ahead and simulate again and watch what happens. So yeah, it becomes a lot more apparent what's actually going on, and it's not good. So to fix this, let's go back to a front view, at least temporarily. And under simulate physics, we can lock an axis. What we're going to do is lock the y-axis. Now with that lock, let's simulate again, and boom, 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 and it just lands right on the ground. And just because it's cool, and for no other reason than that, let's go ahead and take a look at that here inside of our perspective view, and we'll simulate again. Boom, 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 boom. You see it just lands flat and stays aligned with everything, which is very, very cool. So we'll stop. Let's go back over to our front view, and we've got our first alpha sprite set up for our platform, and that is going to wrap things up for this video. So now we will move on and start approaching the setup for our character and some 2D sprite flipbooks.